Colin Powell was the U.S. Secretary of State on 9/11. That made him President Bush's point man on the world stage. He made the case for war with Iraq at the United Nations. On behalf of the administration, Powell claimed Saddam Hussein was trying to buy raw material from Africa to build nuclear weapons, and he gave an elaborate description of an Iraqi weapons program that, as it turned out, never existed.
Ambition and hatred are enough to bring Iraq and al-Qaeda together, enough so al-Qaeda could learn how to build more sophisticated bombs and learn how to forge documents, and enough so that al-Qaeda could turn to Iraq for help in acquiring expertise on weapons of mass destruction.
And now the former Secretary of State says the American government got it wrong. I sat down with General Powell to talk about his speech and his regrets at being the face of false intelligence. I asked him if the information he gave to the United Nations Security Council had been verified.
Of course I did. I gave that speech on 4 days' notice based on an intelligence estimate that had been done months before and provided to Congress. And every word in that speech was gone over by the Director of Central Intelligence and his Deputy Director and all of their experts. And up till 2 o'clock in the morning of that day, they verified everything that was in that speech. So it was nothing that I made up. It was nothing that I stuck in there. And in fact, some people tried to stick extra things in there that the intelligence community wouldn't verify with multi-sourcing. And I said no. And so when I presented that information, it was information that the President believed in, information that my colleagues in government believed in the national security world, Mr. Cheney, Mr. Rumsfeld, Dr. Rice. It was information that the United Kingdom and other nations believed in. And so I presented the best evidence that we had. It was evidence that persuaded the Congress of the United States months earlier to pass overwhelmingly a resolution of support if the President decided that military action was required. And so that's the basis upon which I presented it. Now, because it was me and because it was the UN, it became, a huge event, which is what we wanted it to be.
And chiefly because it was you and your standing in the country.
That's why I was sent to do it.
Yes.
But it turned out, as we discovered later, that a lot of the sourcing that had been attested to by the intelligence community was wrong. Imagine how I felt the day that they finally came in and said to me, well, we don't have 4 independent sources for that biological warfare van. It's one guy, and he's loopy, and he's in a German jail, and we've never talked to him. Hello? And I'm sitting there.
Well, how did you feel?
I felt terrible. And 6 months later, the intelligence community is still standing behind their original judgments, even though nothing has been found. I understood the consequences of that failure, and as I've said on many occasions, I deeply regret that the information, some of the information, not all of it, some of the information I presented, which was multi-source, was wrong. And it is a blot on my record. But, there's nothing I can do to change that blot. All I can say is I gave it the best analysis that I could of all of the information that was there. But we have to remember, it came from a national intelligence estimate agreed to by the intelligence community. There may have been 1 or 2 dissents, and when there was a dissent, I included that. The aluminum tubes, thought they were for centrifuges, but I noted in my presentation that there are other points of view about that. And so
within the State Department, within your intelligence services in the State Department?
Within our intelligence services, the Department of Energy had a different view. My guys were not sure, but it was determined by the Director of Central Intelligence and his deputy and his others that no, we're pretty sure this is what it's for.
John McLaughlin, George Tenet.
Right, but even then I qualified that because there were differences of opinion about it. But you essentially get the information and you accept it or you don't accept it. The Congress had accepted it. The intelligence committees that called for the National Intelligence Estimate accepted it. And many of the people who subsequently were critical of it were those who voted on the basis of that intelligence estimate.
So as we reflect
do I regret it? Of course I do. Yeah.
You do regret it?
Of course.
the Harvard Graduate School of Education, working at the nexus of practice, policy, and research.
You talked about the lessons learned that come from a sense of shame. And that struck me because I'm wondering whether you feel a sense of shame for your fabricated testimony before the UN Security Council in February of 2003.
Hey, relax.
That led to the deaths of thousands of Iraqi children and adults.
The testimony wasn't fabricated. Let me finish. You had your say, now I get mine. You mind?
I didn't
Good.
say anything.
You know, you were leaning down like you wanted to add some more. The testimony wasn't fabricated. It was prepared by the intelligence community. I dismissed anything that somebody would try to add that was not verified by the intelligence community. It was the exact same information that Congress had and examined before they passed a resolution supporting the president if he decided he had to go to war. It's the same information everybody in the administration was using. I was the most visible demonstration of that because of the UN speech on the 5th of February. My presentation was more powerful than the others, but it was all of us were basing the information, our commanders, our diplomats, our Congress, we're all basing it on what the intelligence community believed to be true at the time. Saddam Hussein had used this stuff before. He'd killed thousands of people. He had scared most of the region. We had to put him down once before when he invaded a country. And so after 9/11, there was particular concern that these kinds of devices and weapons, biological or radiological weapons or chemical weapons, could get in the hands of terrorists. And my recommendation, President Bush went to the UN to try to solve it diplomatically. We weren't looking for a war. And after several months of examination, the president decided, as a commander-in-chief, that it wouldn't be solved diplomatically and military action was required. Baghdad fell rather quickly. If we made any mistake, it was not being prepared for the aftermath of the fall of Baghdad. And that I regret. I think we could have done a better job. But you can criticize the presentation, but it was not a fabrication.
Well, your own assistant, Lawrence Wilkerson, has since called it a hoax on the American public and the international community. So you two very much disagree, even though he's there with you the entire time.
I don't think that's quite what Larry said. Larry said now, after the fact, that he thought we should have known that the information was false, but at the time we didn't. Okay, thank you. Next. Remember that the president had many audiences that he had to deal with. The international audience was principally my responsibility, but he had an outraged population. He had 300 million Americans who saw what happened to thousands of their fellow citizens, and we didn't know what else might be coming. So we had to make sure there was not another attack. But I think the president's choice of words were necessary for that moment, to tell the American people that this is an attack that almost rises to the level of World War II and Pearl Harbor, and to mobilize them to go after this enemy as if it was a war like World War II. So I don't object to that language. The word crusade was used once, then we realized, let's not do that one again, because it just creates the wrong kind of imagery in that part of the world. It was not a good choice of words, but it was not used again.
Pretty soon the US started to take military action in Afghanistan against the Taliban regime. And it was crafted as a very surgical type of campaign with a very small number of people on the ground. They talked about light footprint and all these terms. But then today we see 100,000 US troops still there. Would you have conceived back then that we'd be here 10 years later with such a large number of American troops committed?
I wouldn't have conceived it back in the fall of 2001 when we had this exciting action of very sophisticated U.S. technology and special forces married up with people riding horses. I mean, it was the 10th century married to the 21st century, and it worked. But the Taliban turned out to be much more resilient, and al-Qaeda much more persistent in its presence than I think anyone had anticipated back then.
The invasion of Iraq was clearly a much more controversial episode, certainly in Europe. Do you, though, still believe that the invasion and the war was justified in the broader sense?
Well, I think we can't yet make a determination of that. History will make the final determination. And I'm not ducking the question, but think of it this way. Terrible dictator is gone. More than that, a terrible dictatorial regime is gone. Saddam Hussein is no more. Whatever concerns we may have had about weapons of mass destruction from a regime that had them in the past, had used them in the past, and there was no guarantee they would not make them in the future and use them in the future if they got out of sanctions. We don't have to worry about that ever again.